Today we will have the first part of our trip through the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Right now, we are in the city of Pripyat, on the main square. And now you will watch the first part of the video, which we filmed over several sessions. We will try to tell you about Pripyat, its surroundings, what happened here, and what was used for what, as thoroughly and interestingly as possible. Of course, we will try to be ourselves, but you know, the place itself implies that we will be a bit more serious than usual. I hope you'll enjoy this format. On the night of April 26, 1986, an accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is located near the city of Pripyat. The reactor of the fourth power unit exploded, which completely changed the lives of a huge number of people and settlements. More than 600,000 people fought against the consequences of this disaster. And this process continues to this day, more than 30 years after the accident. A vast area, including many villages and even cities, became uninhabitable. And more than 115,000 people were forced to leave their homes. It was supposed to be temporary. The resulting 30-kilometer exclusion zone is located just 70 kilometers from the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. I always wanted to come here, but not just as a tourist, even though in recent years this place has attracted huge numbers of them. I wanted to immerse myself in the atmosphere that prevailed here before, during, and after. April 26, 1986. That's why we made several trips in order to gather as much information as possible and share it with you. Our video today begins at this place. This is the Pripyat checkpoint. We are now going to enter the exclusion zone and show you these truly historic places. We came here with Sanya, we arrived in our own car. We are already on the territory and will be staying here for the next 2 days. That is, we will even be spending the night here. Honestly, I have dreamed of coming here for a very long time. This is my first time in the exclusion zone. I will try to share as much interesting information with you as possible. Maybe some of you have been here, but you know, for me this place is truly special. And despite the fact that it's actually quite close to Kiev, this is our first time here. Even though it's one of the most popular tourist destinations in Ukraine. I'll address questions about radiation right away because people will ask whether it's scary to come here in your own car. The thing is, it's been more than 30 years since the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident, and the half-life of strontium and cesium is actually 30 years. That's why, as of now, since 1986, the radiation level in these areas has dropped by 20,000 times. Right now, we're passing through the first large and fairly populated settlement. This is the village of Zalesye. This was the largest village in the area, with almost 3,000 residents. In total, 188 settlements and more than 100,000 people were relocated from the zone. The village signs here are unusual for us. It looks like an ordinary white sign with a black border. The name of the village is there, but underneath there's also information about how many people lived here before the disaster, the date when the population was evacuated, and also where they were relocated to. And over there, friends, just beyond the trees, is the radar station. That's the over-the-horizon radar station Duga 1. Before we get to the radar station, the very first thing we encounter is another checkpoint, a control post. And here, there's even special equipment that measures radioactive radiation. And when we leave the 10-kilometer zone, we'll be checked as well. And in fact, after this checkpoint, we are officially inside. In the 10-kilometer exclusion zone, you can see reddish trees. This is not a consequence of radiation because the red forest was buried right under itself. These are the consequences of the fires that happened this year. The largest fire in the entire history of this exclusion zone occurred. According to official data, 5% of the forest burned in this fire. According to unofficial sources, as some say, it's about 80%. This is what the forest looks like after the fire, friends. Guys, a Przewalski's horse, actually 2 of them. There's a whole family over there. This used to be an endangered species. And in 1998, 10 of these animals were brought here from Askania Nova. And at the moment, they've adapted, and their population here is now over 200. In a single frame, you get both sadness and joy. On one hand, there's a living population of a rather rare animal species. On the other hand, there's a completely burned out forest. And right in front of us stands a large 150-meter antenna. There's also a shorter one, 90 meters tall. Its length is 750 meters. Only 3 of these were ever built. One was located in Nikolaev as a test site and another in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, but they were dismantled in the 1990s. And this is the only one that remains. They were created for the early detection of intercontinental ballistic missile launches. At that time, it was the Cold War, so the adversary was the United States of America. However, I won't go into too much detail about things I'm not very familiar with, but due to a combination of certain factors and various noises that these antennas picked up, they could only detect launches under specific conditions. They couldn't detect single launches, only a whole series of salvos. An interesting little Easter egg in the form of HBO. For those who might not know, though I think everyone does, HBO made a series or a multi-episode film about Chernobyl. Over all these years, it's the only company that has come as close as possible, even though it's not a documentary, but rather a dramatized series, to conveying everything that happened here, especially in the final episode, where they showed the reasons behind what occurred. If you haven't seen it yet, you definitely should. Even though the series itself wasn't filmed here, the creators did come here. Although about 80% of the series was shot in Lithuania and part of it in Troyeshkina. This is a small town that was built specifically for this antenna, but everything was kept as secret as possible. And that's why in all the documents this town was designated as Chernobyl-2. So that there wouldn't be any unnecessary questions. Even from those who served here. The information was kept secret. Of course, they saw this structure, but it wasn't clear what it was. And here on the cafeteria, you can see what's written there. Long Distance Radio Center. But in reality, this sign doesn't carry any strategic meaning. Let's take a look at what's inside. There was equipment here. These are garages. And it's very symbolic that carbon monoxide is dangerous to life. We really often worry about things that do much less harm than others that are right under our noses. It's very clearly visible how trees have already grown through the roof. And in a way, it's beautiful. But we understand that without human activity, nature very quickly reclaims everything that people have built. And in any case, it overcomes human efforts. Roots grow through, surfaces are destroyed, water seeps in, freezes in winter, and damages the building. And now we are in the driving school room, where soldiers who didn't have licenses were trained. What's interesting is that none of this has been staged. That is, nothing here was restored after the disaster. And look at how well this painting has been preserved. I don't know about you, but I've watched a lot of videos about Chernobyl, and I've never seen this before, ever. I didn't even suspect that something like this existed, and I've always wanted to see it. There's also this kind of relief map here. Well, naturally, it's already a bit worn out. But still, as I understand it, they also used to explain here how things work on the roads. What an enormous structure this is, of course. Right now, we're at its backside. The front faces that way. And guess where? Of course, towards the United States of America. This, friends, is a training center for gathering information and decoding it. Well, information that came from the United States. These are the cabinets for data storage. So basically, this is where, in our terms, hard drives were kept. And this is the control training center. Here, basically, nothing actually worked, but there were lights, buttons you could press. And most importantly, there are decryptions here. Of which missiles? They defended against some, which are still in service in some countries, but most have been decommissioned. There is a decryption of how this entire radar system actually worked. Here are diagrams showing how the signal is transmitted and where it is reflected from. You see, the word ionosphere is there. Even Nikola Tesla suggested that if we learned to interact with the Earth's ionosphere, we could transmit information over long distances. Which in principle is exactly what they tried to do using the radar system. This structure, as well as the one in Komsomolsk on Amur, was also called the Russian woodpecker. But this one only operated in test mode, so to speak, as a training system, while the other was fully operational. In other words, this one was not on active combat duty. Why was it called that? Because when it was operating, the power was so strong that a noticeable crackling sound could be heard on all radio frequencies, which resembled a woodpecker. That's exactly why it was called that. By the way, it also interfered with aviation equipment. There was a moment when the Soviet Union was asked to turn off these devices, even though no one knew exactly what they were, but the power was strong enough to make it clear that something was definitely there. At that time, there were even publications in the US media claiming that the Soviet Union had gone mad, saying they were developing technologies to control the minds of humanity. Some people thought these were devices for weather control. In Norway, they even tried to develop something similar to put everything into antiphase, to counter the signal that was being picked up by the receivers. But in the end, they didn't succeed. In reality, there were three echelons of the Soviet Union's missile shield. The first is satellites, but that's the 1960s to 70s. Before that, some time still had to pass. The intermediate echelon is the OTH radar, the over-the-horizon radar station. And the third echelon is the above-horizon locators. And you might wonder, why are there as many as three? In fact, it's simple, to eliminate errors. And one of the errors, whether it's a legend or, well, you know, this information will most likely never be known to everyone for sure. It's known that it happened right here. There was a solar flare and the antenna interpreted it as a massive missile salvo. But some of the officers turned out to be smart enough, and having recognized this, they didn't report anything. Whether this is true or not, no one knows. And what's interesting is how much this single complex cost the Soviet Union. According to preliminary estimates, just this one cost more than 7 billion Soviet rubles. At that time, the ruble was worth more than the dollar. For comparison, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant cost half as much. But regardless of how it worked, the nuclear power plant actually operated. But no matter how it worked, it didn't harm anyone, whereas this one did. And here, even more hidden in the forest, is a cooling tower for the equipment, which used to operate there. This is what these cooling towers look like from above. Here the asphalt pavement has even been preserved. But naturally, I won't go in there anymore, because as you can see, it's already in a severely hazardous condition. And this, friends, is the KVC building, the Command and Computing Center. Specifically, this room was responsible for managing all the water, cooling, drinking, and fire safety. Here, these little strips which would light up showed where and what kind of circulation was currently happening. These were the control panels. This installation with the globe looks interesting. That hole over there is the sun, and here the stars would light up. This is the ionosphere. And what's interesting is that, of course, all of this was drawn by hand, and any soldier who could draw was immediately assigned. Somewhere, either here or over there, where we've already seen. This is the classroom for party political work with the combat crew personnel. What is this? It's a room for enlightenment. Political education. Here, it's basically propaganda against the United States. Lenin's quotes, the US Armed Forces, weapons of aggression, threat to peace. Everything is handwritten. You can even see the guidelines. And here is the organizational structure of the US Air Force Strategic Air Wing. And this is the control room or command center. There was a large screen there. There were computers here. By the way, they're still here. The screen was taken apart. It was here that all the data collected from this entire complex was processed. People worked here 24/7. It's an interesting room. And what's unusual about it? What's different here compared to elsewhere? A data storage room? The thing is, it's completely lined with metal. The ceiling, all the columns, all the walls. Why was it done this way? Because this is the most secret room, the most classified hall. And in these racks, information was stored. Specifically, the most detailed data that came from the United States. There's even a top secret marking here. And these are the remnants of the computing equipment. Then what's interesting is that in the old days, in the Soviet Union, technical gold, silver, and platinum were used in large quantities in computing equipment. The Duga was only opened for tourists to visit in 2013. And before that time, well, again, these are all just rumors, but since none of it is here anymore, about 20 tons of precious metals were supposedly taken out of here. And these, friends, are hard drives. This is the kind of device where information was stored. All these racks with magnetic disk drives were controlled from this console. We're already approaching the antenna itself. And its length, as you remember, is 750 meters. And this is the cable corridor. Its length is also 750 meters. It starts over there at one end of the antenna and ends at the other end. Cables ran through here. Power cables were at the bottom, and here were the data cables. And for all cycling enthusiasts and aficionados, there's a fun fact. The military used bicycles to move quickly from one end to the other. So where do the turns come from, actually? And all the information was transmitted to the command center. They moved around here on bicycles, and as you can see, they even saw the arc a little bit. These marks here are literally from cutting in the most direct sense. But they only started cutting a small part and then stopped. I'll explain why several presidents became notable in connection with this whole area. The first was Kuchma, who in 2000 shut down the third power unit. As a result, the Kyiv region was undersupplied with electricity for 16 years. The saddest part, remember, we were recently in the city of Slavutich. Most people there were left without jobs, because that's exactly where they worked. The second president was Yushchenko. He did one good thing. He legalized the people who live here. That is, the people who returned here after the forced evacuation, but to their own homes. And the second thing he did was, in fact, legalize the dismantling of everything located in this zone. And so they also started cutting up the radar station. Why did I start talking about this next to it? Because they actually wanted to dismantle it completely, to demolish it. But the thing is, taking it apart in its current state is very expensive and difficult. The most effective way is to bring it down with an explosion. And then, once it's on the ground, you can take it apart and do whatever you want with it. There are two important factors here. If you blow it up, it will fall and raise dust. Not just regular dust, but also radioactive dust. And also from the impact of the fall, a structure this massive would cause strong vibrations. And no one knows how the sarcophagus over the reactor would react to that. And over there, friends, is an elevator you can use to quickly go up to the top. But right now, it's not working. As we walk around the area, we see this quite often. These kinds of graffiti. They're drawn carefully and interestingly. I think it's not entirely right, but still. These drawings, as we can see, all carry some kind of underlying meaning. And here we see a person in a gas mask drawn, meaning a worker. And next to him is a tourist, and above him is like a Pokemon. He raises the question that, if you remember, there used to be the game Pokemon Go, and tourists, when they came here, they didn't want to learn interesting information, take photos, or look around. They just wanted to catch Pokemon. Regarding the radiation situation, with the normal level being up to 0.3 microroentgens per hour, here we have 0.26. So the Duga is now behind us. And over here is the checkpoint and the city that I mentioned earlier, which was named to conceal the facts. Chernobyl-2. Residents were not allowed to cross this border. Only military personnel serving at this facility could. Right now, we are inside the fire station building of the city of Chernobyl-2. And here is an interesting hall like this where there is a model of everything we've just seen. This is the Duga radar station. This in fact is the corridor, a long cable corridor. The training center, the control center. Here we have the boiler house, which we just passed by. And in fact the fire station itself, where we are right now. And everything over there, that's exactly what it is. The city of Chernobyl-2. Right here beside me is already a residential building of Chernobyl-2. This multi-story building can easily go unnoticed from just 50 meters away. Seriously, we passed by one building, then suddenly it appears right in front of you, a second building just like it. And on this side, a third one. Everything here is completely overgrown. These are the rooms, my friends. Some of the household items are even still here. Typical Soviet layouts. This is the kitchen. There's even a stove and a bathroom over there. The bathtub is still here. There's even a mattress left here. Maybe some stalkers used to stay on it. Now we're heading to the local kindergarten. These are the gazebos. This is already part of the playground. By the way, they've been well preserved. Nature doesn't touch its own. Right next to the kindergarten, there's a plane structure, a Soviet fighter jet. What a sight. By today's standards, it looks a bit creepy. We went into the local school, and this is its gym. A lot of things have been preserved here. Look, there are parallel bars, a vaulting horse, ropes hanging, and wall bars. There's even a net under the ceiling still. Now friends, we're in the chemistry classroom. Even the little measuring flasks have been preserved here. Right now we are in the cafeteria. This is the actual place where food was prepared, the kitchen. And I found something that even I still somehow remember. These glass bottles from kefir.
My parents used to exchange them when you lived here. Guys, this is a meat grinder from the past. And you know, I even worked with one like this in the cafeteria. And
this is a refrigerator. A big refrigerator, a cold storage room. And this is the store. Even the signs on the windows have been preserved here. Baby food, coffee, tea. We're leaving the radar station and moving on because there's so much to explore in this area. This, friends, is the new road. It was built after the accident. The one that was here before is about 5 to 10 meters to the right. It was destroyed, so to speak, because even though they tried to decontaminate it, it was too contaminated. And now, in front of us, the view of the new sarcophagus has opened up. People commonly call this structure the arch because its shape resembles an arch. And this is the second tallest structure in this zone. The first is the radar station, the second is the arch, with a height of 109 meters. We have now arrived at the village of Kopachi, which was completely buried because the houses were wooden and it was impossible to properly decontaminate them. This is the motor tractor station in the village of Kopachi. Here we have combines that used to work the local fields, and they are still standing here to this day. Even if you measure this equipment with a decimeter, you can see that it doesn't pose any danger at all. It's about 0.50, 0.58 microrengens per hour. Why? Because firstly, the smoother the surface, the harder it is for radioactive elements to stick to it. But the main thing is that with constant rainfall, and since metal doesn't absorb radiation, accordingly, all of it was washed away a long time ago. And this is a Kraz, and this generation of Kraz had a wooden frame, which naturally couldn't withstand the fire and burned up. The metal structure simply deformed and the frame burned. But the most interesting thing is that there's a radiation symbol here. This means that this particular Kraz took part in the cleanup operation. There's also a trolley bus in this village, even though there was never any trolley bus service in the Chernobyl zone. It used to serve as a temporary shelter for workers in the old days, and until recently, stalkers lived here. But after the fire, of course, no one will live here anymore. Nevertheless, there are places where you can step somewhere you shouldn't. For example, here's a spot that Sanya and I just drove through. And under this cover, there's either a grain of sand or something else, which, of course, we won't touch. And here, the gamma radiation level is 10,000 microrengens per hour, while the normal level is up to 0.3. We've arrived at the fish farm. Here, for experimental purposes, until 2005, they bred fish, trout and some others, and tried to figure out whether it was possible to raise normal fish in a relatively contaminated area. Specifically right here, there used to be water. It was in these pontoons that the fish were bred. There were nets here, the fish were fed, and all of this was underwater. So why was there so much water here? Because this was part of the cooling system. There were pumps here and they operated for a long time. Every day, around the clock, water was pumped here from the Pripyat river. But then, after the plant was shut down, this was no longer necessary. The pumps were turned off, nature took care of everything on its own, and only these little swamps remained. Right here, the fry were raised to a certain size in these small tanks. And then, when they were big enough, they were taken out and placed into those pontoons. And in the neighboring hangar, mink were bred, which were fed with the fish. When the cooling reservoir was created, 2 villages were flooded, and one of them was the Nagortsi hamlet. And all that remains of it is this stele, which reads, "Eternal memory to the heroes." How can you tell if a building was used after the accident? There is plasticate on the floor. It's a material that's smooth and easy to decontaminate. And secondly, you can see that it is heavily curved so that dust can be collected from it more easily. This building was used after the accident. And what did they do in this building? Here, they studied the effects of radiation on the fish that were bred here. There are fry here from those very times and of different kinds of fish. And there are also a lot of empty vodka and other alcohol bottles here. Why? Because, as you know, there is a myth that alcohol removes all this radiation from the body, but in reality it's just a myth. Supposedly red wine can actually help, but you would have to drink so much that your kidneys would fail first. Now we're approaching the cooling tower, which was being built at the same time as the 5th and 6th power units, which, as you know, were never completed. The staircase is basically usable, you could climb up there, but of course we won't be doing that. But the scaffolding at the top is wooden and has been there since those times, so it's already rotted through. It's really not recommended to climb up there at all. And besides, this whole area is very, very heavily guarded. And if you get spotted, the whole of Chernobyl will be here. Just take a look at the scale of this. There's an interesting story behind this mural inside the cooling tower. In fact, it's a photograph that was redrawn in 2016 by the artist Guido van Helten from Australia. The photograph itself was taken by Igor Kostin, a photographer. This is a doctor from one of the Kiev hospitals where the affected liquidators were brought. This, friends, is ISF-2. There's even an ISF-1. And it's not a hotel, it's a storage facility for spent nuclear fuel. Right here we have a wonderful panoramic view opening up. On one side there are the first 4 power units. Further on here we have the unfinished 5th power unit and the foundation of the 6th. In fact, there is information that there were supposed to be 12 power units. 6 on this side of the Pripyat and 6 on the other. And accordingly it was supposed to become the most powerful nuclear power plant in the world, with a capacity of 12,000 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts for each power unit. The 1st, 2nd and 3rd were gradually decommissioned. The last one, as I already mentioned, was decommissioned by Kuchma. And there are several theories as to why this happened. The official one is because of its emergency condition. Well, all of that is clear. However, there is also a version that with these reactors, Ukraine could have regained its nuclear potential, and Western colleagues, to put it bluntly, forced the shutdown of the whole operation. This all falls into the realm of conspiracy theories. No one knows for sure, but local workers say that the 3rd power unit was the most stable, the most reliable, and could have operated for a very long time. And before it was shut down, it was bringing in 700 million hryvnias a year for the country. Let me briefly tell you about this 2nd sarcophagus, the Arch. Actually, before the disaster, this power unit looked like this. This is what it looked like right after the disaster a few months later. Then this is how it looked before the construction of the Arch. So, what exactly is this Arch? This is essentially a rescue suit under which the old sarcophagus will be dismantled and the nuclear fuel will be extracted. But when this will actually happen, no one knows, because first a place needs to be invented for storing highly radioactive nuclear fuel. This arch is made of 2 layers of stainless steel, with an air gap between them that will later be additionally pressurized, and its mass is 36,000 tons. It was assembled in 2 stages 300 meters from here, and then transported. 2 French companies were involved in this work. And then it was transported on Dutch jacks to the place where it is now located. And this structure is even listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the heaviest movable structure in the world. As you can see, the city of Pripyat did not last long, only 16 years. And what's also interesting is that in one of the photographs you can see this very steely, and directly behind it, the nuclear power plant, because none of this forest existed back then. These kinds of machines were used to level the soil, remove layers of earth, and bury buildings. For example, the village of Kopachi was buried using these machines. This train is lying here for a simple reason. It was pushed off the rails by heavy machinery so that the engine could be removed from the locomotive, and all the heavy parts from the cars could be cut out and sent for scrap metal. Here is the locomotive, and as you can see, just as I said, the engine is missing. But all of this was cut up a long time ago, back in the early 2000s. Just at the train station, and now we're crossing the checkpoint, entering Pripyat. It turns out we're now driving through the central district, and only now did I realize that there are high-rise buildings to my right and left, but you just can't see them anymore. We're heading to the river port. This is the Pripyat cafe. The terrace on that side used to overlook the water. Do you remember these vending machines? There was a canopy here with benches underneath it. And then we come right out onto the embankment where those old Raketa and Meteor boats used to be based. But back then, they weren't old. Back then they weren't old and were actually very fast. As you know, Pripyat was evacuated, but people were only supposed to leave here for 3 days. That is, people left and planned to come back. Meanwhile, the authorities really did try to decontaminate Pripyat. And here's an interesting fact. Look, over there on the other side, all of that was artificially filled in. Originally, that was supposed to be the 6th micro-district, because Pripyat was designed for 80,000 residents, but only 50,000 lived there. There was supposed to be another stadium, another school, and another kindergarten there. But when the disaster made its own adjustments, they started bringing in soil there, the topsoil that was being removed. But unfortunately, it was not possible to decontaminate the entire area. This is the terrace of the summer patio, and as you can see, some tables are still left here. Of course, there were no trees here back then. Friends, this is the very hospital, medical unit number 126 of the city of Pripyat. Not because there are 126 of them here. Most likely, that's just how the numbering was done in the region. This is where the first injured liquidators were brought. It was to this very entrance, right here at this driveway, that the first ambulances arrived, and at that time, nurses would remove the victim's clothing and throw it into the basement because there was so much of it. Back then, they didn't understand what they were dealing with. But as we now know, there is a huge stockpile of radioactively contaminated clothing in the basement, and it's still there to this day. I wanted to go down there, but we won't be doing that. After all, we do have our heads on our shoulders because there's alpha, beta, and gamma radiation down there. We don't have any respirators, and it's not even certain that they would help. This is actually the entrance to the basement, which has been filled in with sand. However, you can get in through the windows, but there's no need to do that. Honestly, friends, it's really moving. You walk through all of this and realize that just a few decades ago, life was bustling here. Babies were delivered here, surgeries were performed here. You just look at all these little beds, all these places, the cots, and it makes you sad. This, friends, is the first school in Pripyat, and it was the first to start falling apart, and it happened gradually, several times. The last collapse happened in 2011. We won't be going in there, well, because, as you can see for yourselves. Here's an interesting point. There was no main gas pipeline in Pripyat, yet the houses used gas. That is, the heating was gas-powered, and you can see that there are pipes on the buildings. How was this implemented? Special tanks were filled with liquefied gas. And what's interesting is that here's a building, here's another, and the tanks were right here. And do you know what was next to them? A children's playground. And this is the music school with its preserved mosaic. And in this music school, there is an assembly hall where academic concerts and all sorts of performances were held. And it looks quite impressive. And this is the Prometheus Cinema Hall. This isn't its main entrance, but the name is above me. And I did spot a couple of seats. This is the bas-relief in front of the cinema, and on all such mosaics, in one form or another, atoms are depicted here. Right here in the center is an atom, and this is its radiation. And it's kind of symbolic that atoms are placed here, because the power plant is nuclear. It gave life to this city, and in essence, it also took it away. And next to the Prometheus cinema, there's a pedestal like this, and this is where the statue of Prometheus used to stand. The very one that was moved to the power plant to protect it from vandalism. The symbol of the city, as many people think, was not the Ferris wheel, or rather, today it is, but it used to be Prometheus. And now we've arrived at the central square of the city, which looks like a botanical garden because it's all covered in trees. But as you can imagine, it used to be a spacious square from which you could see almost the entire city. From here, you can see the 16-story building with the coat of arms. Here is the energetic Palace of Culture, just like in Vyshgorod, where all the important events were held. The famous Policia Hotel. And this, my friends, is the ancestor of modern supermarkets as we know them today. Because nothing like this existed before, especially in relatively small towns. The shopping carts here aren't brought in from elsewhere. They really were here back in those days. There were open refrigerators here, and everything was, in principle, familiar by today's standards. Not like the kinds of stores we had in the 90s and 2000s. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence that people here lived quite well. If you look at the average salary, it was about 150 rubles across the country, but here it started from 700. And just look at this small detail. All the signs, including this one for the restaurant, have stripes, little tubes. These are actually neon lights, which are very expensive even today. And I think everyone is familiar with these famous graffiti, which were painted by the international group. They can be found all over Pripyat. Some have survived, some have not. Here, a local girl is depicted on a ball, and over there, a little Donald Trump is making faces. Now I've entered the Palace of Culture. Those are portraits of some Communist Party figures over there. I don't know who they are. And here is a slogan from Lenin. Study, study, study. And everywhere you can clearly see how nature is taking over what was made by human hands. Pay attention to this entrance and take a look at the poplar tree. It is almost as if it is stubbornly saying, I do not care. I am going to grow right here. And this, my friends, is Soviet quality. A carousel that still works to this day. If you touch it, it will keep spinning for a long time. But the main attraction, and the reason many people come here, is the Ferris wheel, which, by the way, was never actually put into operation. This park was never fully opened, and there are even a few myths about it. The first is that the yellow cabins are being repainted, but that's not true. The thing is, they're not made of metal, but of fiberglass, and apparently not even produced here, but in Czechoslovakia. Another myth is that on the day of the disaster, the Ferris wheel was deliberately started to distract the residents. But again, this falls apart under basic logic, because when you go up on the Ferris wheel, it's higher than the trees, and since those trees weren't there, everything would have been visible. And here's another well-known topic. These are the bumper cars, and they were operational. In fact, everything here was ready to be launched. Some things had even started working already. The official opening was planned for May 1st. They missed it by just a little bit. Honestly, it's an amazing place. A place you want to come back to. And for some reason, in my mind, the whole area seemed much smaller. But now I realize that Anya and I won't be able to cover it all in just 2 days. And now, friends, do you know where we're walking? We're walking across the football field. This is about the middle of the football field. You might ask, why are there trees growing here? They used to build it this way to make the game harder. And by the way, people played better too. But actually, you could also ask why it's so hilly. The thing is, they used to remove soil from here, and of course, they never leveled it out afterwards. I can already see that you're getting tired. I'm really hungry. If you've watched up to this point, give us a like. He's honestly already tired and worn out. No, it's just that I'm driving. I have to take photos, I have to film, I have to talk about all this. But I really enjoy all of it. But the sun is still blazing, and we haven't eaten since 5. Well, I haven't eaten since 5:40 in the morning. And this grandstand, friends, has 2,000 seats. It's really awesome. Honestly, you won't find a building like this in many places. Not to mention Vyshgorod, where the situation with the grandstand is just total chaos. But even so, you didn't really have to come here because none of these trees were here and there were houses built all around. 10-kilometer zone. They're going to check us. Put your hands in. Clear. Clear. Well, we got lucky. It says hungry. We're entering Chernobyl. It's quite an old town. Right at the entrance to Chernobyl, there's this kind of exhibition where you can see equipment, some more familiar to us in the background, but also specialized, and robots. These aren't just some display models. These are the very robots, some of many, that took part in the disaster cleanup, working on the roof of the third reactor, because the fourth reactor's roof was gone. They're all quite different, all electric, remotely controlled by wire, but along with them, the military was also involved. In principle, it would have been possible to manage without them, without the military, but it would have required more effort. However, it wouldn't have been necessary to sacrifice people's health and lives. By the way, this one looks like a lunar rover, because it's actually based on the lunar rover platform. Well, here the city is even inhabited, and you can see that. Personnel from contracting organizations and staff servicing the exclusion zone live here. Today, we're staying overnight in Chernobyl. We have a hotel here. By the way, there are several of them here, one state-owned and, if I'm not mistaken, 2 commercial ones. The city is well maintained and not abandoned. It doesn't look abandoned at all. In fact, it's inhabited. There are even people on the streets. Well, that's worth mentioning. It's kind of surprising that there are people on the streets considering where we've been today. But you know what surprises me the most in this whole situation, and even scares me a little? We were just walking around Pripyat, looking at all of this, and there were several scenarios that by sheer luck didn't happen. Scenarios that could have turned Kyiv, Vyshhorod, and other places into another Pripyat. The simplest scenario is just the weather conditions. Because the wind was blowing in a different direction, the radioactive cloud simply went the other way. And by the way, it was actually in Sweden, at a nuclear power plant, that they first noticed something was wrong and they started sounding the alarm. But if the wind had been blowing in the other direction, all of this would have gone straight through Kyiv. And that, of course, would have been tragic. Another scenario. If there had been a second explosion, there were all the prerequisites for that to happen. Another scenario. There were nuclear warheads here. But honestly, my brain has already stopped working, and my tongue is getting twisted every other word. So I just need to eat something now and go rest. And tomorrow we have another day ahead, Sonia. Yeah. So friends, the room. 1 bed, 2 beds, there's a TV, there's even Wi-Fi here. And there's even a private bathroom, a bathtub with a shower, and a toilet. It's not a luxury suite, but in these conditions it's amazing. There are even a few shops here, and even a cafe. Now we're going to have dinner.